Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carolyn McCollum, and as the co-chair of the Z. Smith Reynolds Library Lecture Series, I would like to welcome everyone to today's lecture, Change and Continuity in the 2012 Election. Our guest speaker is Dr. John Dinan, professor in the Department of Politics and International Affairs. Dr. Dinan received his BA, his master's, and his doctorate from the University of Virginia. His research focuses on state constitutionalism, federalism, and American political development. He is the author of several books, including The American State Constitutional Tradition and Keeping the People's Liberties, Legislators, Citizens, and Judges as Guardian of Rights. He is currently the chair of the Federalism and Intergovernmental Relations section of the American Political Science Association. Here at Wake, he teaches classes in American government and politics, political parties, voters and elections, Congress and policymaking, and state politics. For today's lecture, Dr. Dinan will assess the various ways in which the 2012 election campaign represents continuity with prior election campaigns, and also consider various ways that the 2012 election campaign represents a departure from prior election campaigns, taking note of the role of battleground states, campaign financing, and other factors that are traditionally important in election campaigns. So without further ado, Dr. John Dinan.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation from the committee to do so. I'm almost a little disappointed the music turned off. That was so good, but I understand. So thank. Well, I take it this is an audience which I'm gathering is pretty attuned to the race, following the races, soaking up as much in the way of journalistic commentary, journalistic reporting, whether on the internet, on Twitter, take your pick, and so. I take as my premise here today that political science has something nevertheless to contribute over and beyond journalistic commentary and reporting, and so I take that as my challenge and my premise to say what that could be. There's something to be understand from understanding the structure of previous campaigns, and then taking notice on patterns and structures, and then fitting 2012 into that. Now, some political scientists say, sure, we have something to contribute. Here's what we do well as political scientists. We're good at developing statistical models where we take note of what's happened in previous elections, and we'll make predictions and forecast what will happen in 2012. So here's what they do. They'll say, well, what was the economic growth rate in the first quarter or the second quarter of the election year? What's the presidential approval rating in Gallup as of Labor Day? Is there a war going on? They have a series of variables, and they plug these in. I should say, and so this is one group of political science, I should say as political scientists have kind of started doing this, as a cottage industry really of this kind of efforts. And there's now every 4 years one of the journals published by the American Political Science Association publishes a symposium where they take the contributors and say, don't tell us after the election what your predictions were. Go ahead and put it in October so we can kind of test and see what happens later on. And so actually they're just out in the journal PS, Politics and Political Science and Politics. So I had 13 contributors, and I can report that 5 of the models predicted a Romney victory, and 8 of the 13 models predicted an Obama victory. So that's one group of political science. Well, in my classes, and after all, for these groups, they can publish these results in October because the campaign for these political scientists doesn't really matter because it's all about these fundamental factors. Well, in my classes, I take note of these models. I spend usually a day or so on them, and in a parties and elections class I teach. I also take note of the fact, as we just took note of, that there's conflicting results from these models even in 1 year. There's even mixed success rates of these models in prior years on how close they've come. I should say they go down to the 1 decimal point in terms of predicting the outcome in that sense, so they're very precise in these ways. I suppose this is not necessarily what I view as political science is necessarily highest contribution. Again, there's different groups within political science, and so we could as easily have someone up on this podium here next week offering the best case for this. But I want to suggest that in some ways what I want to do here today is in some ways more modest than what these other political scientists seek to do. But also, I would suggest maybe seeks to probe a little more deeply than what these models do. In that I'm less concerned with predicting an outcome of a race, after all, whose outcome we will know in just over a month. Well, I say that, but I could have said that in 2000 at this point. That wouldn't have been accurate because there was still 36 days to follow. But in general, we'll probably know the outcome within a month. And so I'm less concerned with that and more concerned with pinpointing the key factors that influence the behavior of the campaigns and the candidates and identifying some underlying patterns that we could see from prior election years. What are the recurring patterns? What's the structure, one might say, of a campaign for a presidential election? And I say by identifying these patterns and structures, I don't mean to say that these means that candidate behavior is foreordained or fated in any way, that you have to follow those structures. Rather, there's an overlying structure within which you operate, and then there's particular choices that candidates have to make. In fact, some of the more interesting aspects of campaigns is when candidates have choices to make and to see which choices they take and which ones they don't. In short, I want to talk this afternoon about what some of the patterns are in presidential campaign behavior and also alert us to some of the key choices that are made within those structures and the way those choices are being made in 2012. The idea is also that such an analysis that might help us to kind of shed light on, maybe even explain some otherwise potentially surprising features of the 2012 election, or at least notable features. For instance, why is it when the conventional wisdom holds that candidates during the primary move to their base, but then in the general election they move to the center? Why is that at best difficult to necessarily perceive that happening this year around? Why is it the case, for instance, that regarding the TV ads that we're seeing in North Carolina, the latest study shows that we're the fourth heaviest advertised state in the country in that sense. Regarding these TV ads, why do they seem to aim so low in their aims, in their content, in almost issue-free sometimes, and deal with what might be considered best peripheral issues? Why also do the candidates seem to be talking past one another so much, not only in their campaign appearances, but in their ads, and even to some extent in the debate last night? Why is this? Well, my claim is that much of these and other features of the campaign can be understood by really studying two main factors. One, that we're in an increasingly polarized country that's dramatically more polarized than we were just a decade and certainly 2 decades ago. And second, that we're in the midst of an incumbent re-election campaign whose rhythms differ significantly from an open seat campaign. These are two very simple points, but I want to show today why we can understand a lot about the 2012 campaign by exploring them in some detail. I'm about to talk about the presidential campaign, but before I do, I always in my classes make a plea for not ignoring all the other races on the ballot in any given year. We spend so much attention focused on the presidential race, and here I'm about to focus that attention here today. But before I do, I almost feel guilty about doing so, but before I do, let's just remind ourselves, control of the U.S. Senate is at stake in this election. North Carolina doesn't have a Senate seat, but a pickup of net 3 seats for Republicans would pull them to a 50-50 tie in the Senate. Contrary-wise, control of the House could be at stake. If Democrats pick up a net of 25 seats in the House of Representatives, they would move to regain the majority in the House. Or at the state level, 11 states holding governor's elections this year. North Carolina, of course, one of them. I don't know how many people here knew that there was the first North Carolina governor's debate last night before the presidential debate. Many of you, sounds like this is an engaged audience, so you knew this. But if I was speaking to a less engaged audience, people say, might not be as aware of that. At the state legislative level, all the seats in North Carolina are on the ballot. It would take just 6 seats for Democrats to regain and pull even in the state Senate. It would take just 8 seats for Democrats to pull even in the state House. And this isn't even to mention the state judicial elections, where technically North Carolina has nonpartisan judicial elections as we've had for the last 10 years. In practice, that just means the parties have to work harder to inform people about who their preferred candidate is, in that sense. And there clearly are 2 preferred candidates for the Supreme Court seat. And essentially, control of the North Carolina Supreme Court is at stake, is on the ballot this year, along with, I should say, the survivability of the Republican-drawn redistricting maps last year, which are essentially will be decided by the outcome of one North Carolina State Supreme Court election. And I haven't even mentioned the various ballot measures around the country. North Carolina doesn't have any ballot measures. We had ours, of course, in May in that sense. But other states will. Minnesota will have another same-sex marriage amendment question on their ballot this November. States will be voting, the public will, on whether or not to not just legalize medical marijuana, but all forms of recreational marijuana in some states. Other measures I could put on. In short, I'm going to focus on the presidential election. But again, my plea is there's a lot else out there, and I don't mean in any way to minimize the importance of those by talking as I'm going to talk today. Well, to get on to my promised analysis of the presidential campaign, first and most important factor for understanding the behavior of the candidates in 2012 is the simple fact that they're facing an increasingly polarized electorate. Now, there is admittedly some dispute in the literature and to some degrees in journalistic commentary. Exactly how polarized are we? And are we all that polarized as correct? Or maybe it's just the elites that are polarized and members of Congress are polarized and it's not so much the general public. And yet increasingly we found the general public is polarized as well. I could present some various pieces of analysis of this, but let me just look at the Gallup polling for presidential approval ratings. Gallup adds up at the end of each year. They say, what was the average approval rating? How did Republicans view a sitting president? How did Democrats view a sitting president? President Obama's third year, so the last time we have records for this, 80% of Democrats approved of his performance, 12% of Republicans approved, for a 68% partisan gap. Well, President Obama's third year was more polarized than any previous third year, as was his second year, more polarized than any previous second year of a president, as his first year was more polarized than the first year of any previous president. The only things exceeding those were George W. Bush's fourth year of his presidency, fifth year of his presidency, sixth year of his presidency, and seventh year of his presidency. In fact, the record was 2004, when there was a full 76 percentage point difference in how Republicans and Democrats viewed President Bush. 91% of Republicans approved of the job that he was doing in office, and 15% of Democrats did. That's a polarized electorate. There's just no way getting around that. We have the same president. This even applies to when they ask people, how do you think the economy is doing? And right now there's dramatic gaps in how the Democratic respondents say, I view the economy as doing well or poorly, and how Republicans do. That's an age of polarization. As recently as the 1980s, early 1990s, you could still look around and you can find sizable numbers of conservative Democrats, liberal Republicans. Those are practically, though not entirely, extinct species, certainly in Congress, and also, to a significant extent, in the general public. Over the last 2 decades, voters have increasingly completed a process of sorting out and aligning their ideology with their partisanship. That is, it once wasn't the case. We have to take ourselves back. I mean, that it wasn't always the case these days that ideology goes hand in hand in partisanship. It was not, and now it practically is. It's not just that your ideology lines up your partisanship, conservatives lining up with Republicans, progressives lining up with the Democratic Party. It's that this is a geographic segmentation where people live in states and counties primarily with other like-minded individuals. If you look at the election map in 2008, not a single county voted for Obama in the state of Oklahoma. Not one. On the other hand, not a single county in Massachusetts voted for McCain. This is a simple situation. So not only have polarized states, but we have polarized areas within states. We could almost just, maybe it's an example that would kind of help to drive this home for folks. During the May 2012 Amendment 1 debate in North Carolina, one could drive around some neighborhoods, perhaps close to Wake Forest, and one could find, if one did find signs, they would all be the light blue signs. Vote no. And sometimes it was rare in a single neighborhood to find anything other than that on the other side. And yet if one drove about 10, 15 minutes kind of out of town, you might almost encounter the reverse, where you would be in some neighborhoods where you'd only see the dark blue vote yes signs, and not a light blue one to be found. I just use that as an illustration just to kind of bring home of a polarized, we're polarized and we're segmented geographically in that way, in ways that we weren't always. It's not even just that we line up partisanship with ideology, and oftentimes in geographic ways, but in terms of demographic groups within the electorate, we see clear divisions. It once was the case that income was the clearest predictor. As income levels increased, you would see support for Republicans increase. This was probably what Mitt Romney was getting at with his 47% analysis of say, well, there's 47% of the voters who are at this income tax level, and so they're likely not going to vote for me, and so I'm not going to seek their vote. Probably not only wasn't good politics to say that, but it probably wasn't the best political science analysis today. Income is not so lined up in the way it once was. Obama won a majority of voters making more than $100,000 a year in 2008. In fact, if there's one, used to be if you could ask one piece of information about a voter, say, I want to predict which party you're going to be, you'd say, well, what's your income level? And that still is the case in a number of countries, other countries. But in the United States today, actually, if you could ask one piece of information, it turns out you'd ask about the frequency of religious worship attendance, which actually trumps income. And with increasing frequency is greater support for Republican support. Turns out that trumps the power of income at levels. Increasingly then, different issues come up, different divisions. Prior to 1980, this is again surprising, there was no such thing as a gender gap in voting behavior. For many years, people thought after women's suffrage that there might be actually meaningful differences in voting behavior for the parties. We simply didn't find it. All of a sudden, 1980, it comes about, and every election since then, there has been a consistent gender gap. In 2008, Barack Obama won among women voters by 13 percentage points, and he narrowly lost among male voters by 1 percentage point. In short, we're polarized in various ways. It even lines up with various groups. And so the point is, and to get the implications for the election, in this situation, we know going into this election that some 90% of Republicans will vote for Romney, some 90% of Democrats will vote for Obama, and that's simply the fact of the situation going in. And so what does this mean? And you might say, well, but aren't number of independents rising? Yes, the number of unaffiliateds are rising, but this masks what we know as political scientists, that most unaffiliated still lean one way or the other, and to look at them as true independents or unaffiliated would mask actually real affiliation. And so it really is the case that when the candidates look out there, they say, who are my strong supporters? And their campaign revolves to a great extent about how do I get my core supporters to be energized and turn out at the polls, because they know that that's a big part of the strategy. And you can see this, how is this manifested, this desire of the candidates to kind of energize their base, what we call kind of really make sure that their core supporters are on board. Again, I'll use the North Carolina same-sex marriage kind of issue as an example. It was the day after North Carolina voted by a surprisingly large number in favor of the amendment that President Obama came out and announced his support for same-sex marriage. Some people looked at that as surprising timing in that sense. But given our polarized era and the kind of the incentives for a candidate, that wasn't surprising at all. Or think of Mitt Romney. Think of the Romney campaign. In all the discussion of vice presidential pick, there was all this talk about possible picks that Romney could have made that would kind of reach to the center. Condoleezza Rice's name came up, perhaps not all that seriously, but it certainly came up, and other candidates did. Mitt Romney didn't go in that direction at all. He chose someone who couldn't have been more appealing to the conservative base, and that is in Paul Ryan. That's a decision which in some ways might be surprising, but in an era of polarized electorate, it makes sense. And think of Paul Ryan's speech at the Republican convention. It was as full-throated a defense of economic, social conservatism as one could have expected. All this makes sense in a polarized environment when one of your chief tasks is to get your supporters at the polls. But there are some undecideds. I don't want to minimize those, but really we're talking no more than 10, maybe 12% of the electorate at best go into an election that could go a different way. What's notable here is that not only how small that number is, but the makeup of the undecideds. When political scientists study, well, who are the people that are the undecided voters versus the committed voters? And here's the conclusions that are generally reached. The undecided voters are likely to be the least politically attuned, the least politically informed, and the least politically engaged. In a polarized era, as education levels increase, as engagement levels increase, who are these voters that kind of figure out what side they're on? It's the most engaged, most informed, most attuned. Who are the ones that are left undecided? Different group. Well, what does that mean for the candidate's campaign? It means that to the extent that the candidates do seek to persuade this relatively small group of undecided voters, they face some real challenges. First of all, how to reach them. These are not the most politically attuned or engaged. So first of all, you have to, how do I reach them to make an appeal? And then second, because their political resources for processing certain types of ads are lower than some of the other, the more polarized individuals, the types of appeals you would make to them would be particular. So where do candidates find these voters? Well, let's look at where candidates have been in recent months. The View, Live with Kelly and Michael, Letterman, Leno. That's where you're going to reach these voters. They're not tuning into cable news for political. That's for the polarized folks that go there kind of making sense. They're not seeking out politics. You've got to come to them when they tuned into late night TV, not necessarily to be tuned into politics, but for something else. And if you can get in there and get a political message, all the better for you. And I say, when you do try to appeal to the undecideds in this environment, whether on these shows or the incessant TV ads in the battleground states, you're frequently going to make your appeals perhaps on issues that might be peripheral to the ones that otherwise are central to public policy. Just think about, sometimes if I'm over at the Y and daytime, and I see sometimes there's not a single ad that runs in the middle of some shows that's not a campaign ad of some kind. And if I had to say, the one that seems to be the heaviest in rotations are ones that deal with getting tough on China in some ways. Well, for textile workers in North Carolina, I don't want to deny the possibility that issue would hit home. But one of the top 10, one of the top 20 even issues that are at stake in this election, no, it's not there. They simply aren't there. I was speaking at a group at the Shepherd Center, Adventures in Lifetime Learning, earlier this week, and we were talking. And the woman, she noted, she said, I'd always wanted to be in a battleground state and get what Ohio and Florida always get. And now it's here, and I see all the ads, and it's not quite what it cracked up to be. I had this sense that we'd be getting, the ads would be a different tone. Maybe it was even tougher, she said, because she'd just been to the Bowles Simpson event here at Wade Chapel the week before. And she said, talk about an elevated tone of the discussion. Talk about people setting out the crucial issues and saying, here's what will face the president over the next 4 years. And then to contrast that with the type of ads that are run. She says, I'm not sure battleground state status is all that was meant to be. But as I say, understandable in a polarized electorate where on one level you play with vice presidential picks and policy decisions to your base and energize them, but then in your ads and other ways you appeal to an undecided voters and you appeal to them in a particular way. Well, the overall point, to sum up this first part of my talk, is that the candidate campaigns in 2012 are necessarily going to be different from the candidate campaigns of the 1980s and 1990s, precisely because of the nature of the polarized electorate today, more so than in the past. Well, turning to the second point I want to make here. If the 2012 election and the last several elections are different in this regard from elections in prior decades, in another sense, this is the second point I want to make, the division isn't so much chronological, it's that we're different today than we were 10 or 20 years ago. It has to do with what type of election you're encountering. Are you involved in an incumbent re-election race, or are you involved in an open seat race? Incumbent race is obviously where we are today. And I want to make the claim that in analyzing elections and patterns, the 2012 election, with Obama running for re-election, is going to be broadly similar, in some ways at least, to going back 1980, when President Carter sought re-election, or 1984, when President Reagan sought re-election, or 1992, when Bush 1 sought re-election, or 1996, when Clinton sought re-election, or 2004, when Bush 2 sought re-election. And in that sense, different from open seat races where there was no incumbent on the ballot, thinking here of the election of 1988, or the election of 2000, Bush v. Gore, or the election of 2008, most recently. Well, why is this important? It's important because it affects the degree to which a campaign is framed as a referendum election or a choice election, and that's the principal point I want to draw out here. There are always some elements of both. That is, all elections are in some degrees a referendum on how you think things have been doing over the last 4 years. How's the country been doing? How's the economy been doing? There's always some element of that, regardless of whether the incumbent is on the ballot or not. Voters are always going in there saying, if I liked how the party in power did this last 4 years, let me give them another 4 years. And if I'm displeased, let me vote for another party. There's always some element of referendum then. And there's always, you might say, some element of choice. By choice, I mean, when voters are thinking of elections as a choice election, they're making a judgment on the merits of the two candidates before them and their competing positions and policies. So there's always going to be some element of referendum, some element of choice. But an open seat rate, when you have an open seat, there's necessarily a heightened focus on choice and less so on referendum, because the incumbent isn't directly on the ballot. And so it's tougher to kind of hold accountable somebody on the ballot. Although one need only look back to 2008, where George Bush might as well have been on the ballot in some degrees campaign-while. That was an effort, and so it was still a choice, but it was also in part a referendum. Well, my point here, we're obviously in an incumbent re-election race. So let me draw out these implications. What does it mean? Why is it important to kind of focus on this? Well, the election is going to be, to a great extent, a referendum on the last 4 years, certainly more so than in a choice election. But, and here's where the element of candidate discretion comes in mind, the candidates have an ability within this overall pattern and structure to try to frame the election in ways that they want to. So an incumbent always has the opportunity to say, I want to embrace the referendum model, or I want to kind of steer things away. Classic example of embracing it was Reagan in 1984. You can think of his ad campaigns. Say, get 4 more years of this if you like it. That was embracing the referendum. Sometimes an incumbent will see it as an advantage not to embrace the referendum model and to argue the real question at hand is a choice between competing philosophies and policies. Some of this was evident in 2004, where Bush, running for re-election, tried as much as possible, particularly as the Iraq War moved along and casualties mounted, tried as much as possible to say this is a choice between John Kerry and me. And this is clearly the case in 2012. One need only look at the opening paragraph of Obama's acceptance speech in Charlotte, where he said, you face a great choice in this election. He led right off with this. I mean, he was very much embracing the choice model. He said, look, be very clear. You have 2 very different choices to make in this election. Or think about the way that in last night's debate, the way that they started off talking about the economy. And as much as possible, what did President Obama want to do? He wanted to shift the discussion to tax policy of Mitt Romney. So whenever you had a chance, it was clear things, both candidates had things they wanted to accomplish in there. And he said, I want to talk about the choice faced of what happened if we had your tax plan in power versus another one. That's someone trying to embrace the choice model. Well, how about the challenger? Challenger also has some discretion here. Can embrace or not embrace the referendum model? And here's where Romney has had some interesting decisions to make. Up until the last few weeks, it looked pretty clear that Romney was embracing the referendum model. Think of his convention. Not a whole lot of setting out of, here's the policy choices you'd face with a Romney president versus Obama president. It was, if you're unhappy with the last 4 years, I'm an acceptable alternative. That's someone who's operating on the referendum model. Last 2 weeks, though, as polling seemed to suggest maybe that wasn't enough to get the job done, there's been some renewed kind of looking at maybe the choice model. And think of that last night, if you had those of you who watched the debate, if you had to see Romney, his closing statement was exactly the choice model. Some of you may remember this. He said, you face a choice here, you face a choice here. But I wouldn't say that was the dominant mode of the Romney as a candidate in that debate. Think of his memorable lines. Well, your plan isn't working. Well, you've had 4 years. Well, these people are hurting. That's a referendum model. That's saying, if you're unhappy, then vote for me. You don't even necessarily need to look at the policies I'm bringing in. Just, if you're unhappy, I'm the alternative. And so I still think that you see Romney going in both directions. I would still say he's generally following the pattern. I want to basically close with an additional point along these lines. Regardless of whether a candidate embraces the referendum model or the choice model, the best way to think about a campaign is not about efforts at persuasion in the classic sense. That is a classic sense of persuasion we might have in our mind, that both candidates put their education policies side by side and say, I'm going to persuade you that my education plan is better than the opponent's education plan, and you might persuade people on that lines. What we find is that is actually rather infrequent, that's how decisions in voting get made. What do we find instead? We find it's all about framing issues that are favorable to you and telling the voters this is the most important issue. That is, rather than having a conversation on the same issue, each side knows if we're talking about these issues, I'm probably doing well. And if we're talking about these issues, the other candidate's doing well. And so the best way to think of a modern campaign in this type is of an efforts for the candidates to say and make the election, this election is really about these issues. And oftentimes those aren't going to be the same issues that the other candidate's talking about. Let me just give some examples to kind of flesh this out. If you had to sum up the Obama-Biden campaign, you'd probably go back to Joe Biden's acceptance speech at the convention, where he summed things up in a pithy fashion. He said, bin Laden's gone and GM's not. Right? I mean, that gives you a sense of what are the key issues then that Obama campaign wants to think about. Think about the bin Laden issue and some foreign policy successes, and then think about the key decision about auto company resurgence. If the election, if that's what voters are thinking when they go into the ballot box, the Obama campaign is very happy. Note that it's not that the Romney campaign comes and necessarily engages them on those points, really. Again, last night's debate wasn't about foreign policy. Interesting enough, the auto issue didn't come up to a great degree. But even on other occasions, you wouldn't really see an engagement. What does the Romney campaign want to do? They want to actually say, no, this election is about this issue. What would they most like it to be about? If people are going on thinking about $16 trillion in debt, the Romney campaign saying, that's where we want to be. And neither candidate really sees it as in their interest to engage directly the other side and persuade them. That's tougher work. They say, well, we should be talking about our issues rather than the other one. Think about what's interesting here is some of these points I've just made to try to illustrate these. But what's also interesting is, as notable as what is on the agenda for terms of framing as what's not. Note, for instance, that for many years Republicans looked at taxes as their issue. As long as the election was seen as about taxes, Republicans said, we're in good terrain, that's our turf. Notice who wanted to bring the discussion of taxes last night, though. It was Obama that kept saying, let's talk about taxes. That's when I talk about notable differences from previous years. That's interesting and notable that the Obama campaign saw in the current electoral environment. That actually is a winning issue for us to talk about that. Note in another direction, this is still tough to figure out, healthcare issue. For many years, it was always Democrats. If they were talking healthcare, and that was the centerpiece of the election, they were on good terrain and they could feel good. It's a little more complicated this year. You might say, if you're going back to last night's debate, certainly Romney seemed to want to bring that up as much as Obama, although at the same time Obama didn't shy away from it. So that's one of these issues that there was actually some engagement on and perhaps even some persuasion. The overall point here is that if we get a sense in following this year's campaign that to a great extent the candidates are talking past one another and in some ways having separate conversations, whether one of them saying this is a choice, the other one saying this is a referendum, or one of them saying this issue is about bin Laden and GM, and the other one is saying this is about debt increases. That's probably right that it's happening. And it's probably explainable that it's happening given the incentives that face the different candidates. Well, let me just close by reemphasizing two things, and I hope there'll be some chances for us to talk about these issues or some others that might be on your mind. One, let me just make my renewed plea. Presidential election is not the only thing on the ballot. Many things on the ballot, and what's so kind of disconcerting about this is that we know from studies of state elections that many state elections are essentially determined by what happens at the top of the ticket, and then who turns out to vote or who turns out to cast a straight party ticket based on the decision they make in the presidential race. So it's concerning on so many levels. First of all, we give all our attention to the presidential race, and then how we decide in the presidential race and how we turn out in that level basically affects all these other races. So that's my renewed plea for paying attention to that. And then second, just to go back to my initial point, I think political science has something that it can contribute to our understanding of an ongoing campaign. I take my title here from a book that comes out usually after each year's campaign called Change and Continuity in the Elections. And they do it after the election. I've tried something a little different. Here we are on the fly in the middle of election. How can we take a look at some of the things that we see going on around us? Candidates who seem not so much to be moving to the center, but still as much playing to their base. TV ads that are perhaps disappointing in their content and aims, separate conversations in the candidates. How might political science help us to kind of at least understand or put into context why the campaign is happening the way it does, and what are some of the key decisions in this context that the candidates are making with the implications? So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your time. I'd love to answer questions. How should we, is that possible? Yes, Ross.
So I agree about the polarization issue, and it has all the way down the ticket then real implications for governing, right, as we've seen in Congress with this gridlock. Do you see it as a polarization is here to stay? Is this a pendulum swing? Do you think the country will swing back? Do we need to figure out ways to fix the governance issue if we're always going to be this polarized, third party, whatever?
You know, to answer that, we'd have to get a real handle on, well, what are the causes of polarization before we'd have sense. And here there's different theories out there. Some folks have focused on media segmentation, and others say, well, but people are already polarized when they choose the media sources that they want to go to. But then people say, well, even so, the media reinforces their existing choices. So that's a part of the story in that way. Others have looked at particularly the geographic sorting out, that if we're living in certain communities where we're mostly encountering like-minded folks, that again is a reinforcing measure. But some people again say, well, increasingly people are choosing to live in communities with like-minded people, so that puts us back, well, what polarized them? You know, one study that's been done puts the emphasis, interesting enough, on increased educational levels and political engagement. And that if we really want to see why we've become more polarized in recent years, people, as education levels increase, people have had a better ability to sort through and process and put into structure their political views, and then to really just find their home and stick in that home. Now, if that's the explanation, you know, well, there's certainly no sign that education levels are declining, and one wouldn't put as a reform, well, let's put a cap on that. So if again, there's different explanations for them, and we'd have to sift through the merits of those. But suppose we did take this as something that's with us at least for some time, what would you do? Well, one possibility is for one group, nobody said we could, just because we're polarized, we have to be 50-50 polarized. Maybe one group can dominate the other one and be 60-40 and get 60 votes in the Senate, and then they can still get their way done. And then we don't see any decline in polarization, but one side can just get something done because they're in power. The other side is to, even if the public is polarized, to expect those in Congress and those in the presidency to work across the aisle. But that's tough, because when we do see people crossing the aisle, we don't usually see them rewarded for it. Think of some of the people who've cast aisle crossing votes in recent years. 3 Republican senators voted for the stimulus only. One of them, Marlon Spector, left the party because there's no chance of being renominated, as he saw in Pennsylvania. Another one, Olympia Snowe, announced that she's not running for re-election this year, and so there's only one left. We could put some similar examples on Democratic side. Some of the Democratic members of Congress who voted against the health care law because they said it's going to be a tough vote to cast yes in my district, they were defeated in the Democratic primaries. They said, look, we put you in here because we wanted a Democratic vote, not someone who's going to vote like a Republican. So there's little incentive to expect the people in office to do so. So I don't leave you with a very hopeful answer. I'm not sure if I've left with an answer at all, but I've at least talked about it. So thanks, Russ. Other questions folks might have? Yes, Anderson?
So if I'd say the general consensus is that Romney won the debate last night, at least in debate terms. Do you think his numbers will improve?
Yeah. What to say about this? And I think that is the general consensus. It's interesting if we actually said, well, what is that consensus based on? What is it? In terms of actual kind of, as I say, persuasion and policy answers, I don't know that one would necessarily find a big difference between the answers. I think we're probably talking, as we usually talk with debate analysis, on stylistic matters, whether matters of where you looked at the camera or not, whether you looked at the moderator or the other candidate, whether you seemed poised, whether you seemed overly engaged or to some extent slightly disengaged. So I just comment on that. That's when we talk about a consensus. We are really talking about those factors. I don't mean to say anything other than just to say that that's the decisions are made, and that's entirely in keeping with evaluations of previous debates. If we see debates that have made a difference, we can point to two, really, and there's some interesting things to be said here. The very first debate in 2000, Al Gore was actually leading George W. Bush by about 8 percentage points going into the first debate in 2000. You'll recall Wake Forest held the second debate in 2000, so we weren't there for the first debate. But in the aftermath of that first debate, actually Bush was emerging the leader in the Gallup polls, and Gore was behind, and that fell into a pattern. What was going on there? Was it any great policy differences that were exposed there? No, again, it was stylistic differences. It was the camera was oftentimes on Gore when he was engaged in some excessive sighing and gesturing that came across badly. Again, I just want to keep making sure when we talk about analyzing debates, what is the currency of what's going on here? So that was another time. The other time that happened, and this was perhaps similar to what we see in 2012, is in the Bush-Kerry first debate in 2004. Bush had actually a bit of a healthy lead going into the first debate, and Kerry actually moved that to be about an even race as a result of the first debate. Interesting to see what some of the comments were after Bush's performance of the first debate in light of last night. They said he seemed a little bit tired. He seemed a little bit disengaged. He didn't seem as energized and poised as his candidate. Again, some people have made similar comments about last night. Let me just say, though, sometimes these are fleeting effects, sometimes they're long-lasting effects. And I take it that one of the things that you're asking to get at is how long an effect could this be. In 2004, it had a bit of a lasting effect. That is, it wasn't looking going into that debate as if Kerry would make this a competition, and clearly he did make it a competition, but for Ohio, Kerry could have been president. And so that debate is credited with bringing him up to that point. In 2000, probably even more so, that Bush took his lead, which then ended in essentially a virtual tie as a result of that debate. The one thing it does, just to close off this point, the narrative clearly over the last week or two in the press and even in the campaign discussion was of difficulties and challenges for the Romney campaign. And clearly with each new batch of polling that would come out, that would demoralize various Republican supporters. And perhaps think again about these undecided voters and what shifts their views. Again, the least kind of politically informed, engaged, they're the most likely to be shifting with, if they see a group of polls that show the one candidate's in the majority, you feel more confident if you're joining a majority than if you're joining a minority. So for the Romney camp, it was very important for that narrative to change, and all of a sudden the narrative changes at least for one day and perhaps for a few days. And so in that sense could be seen as having lasting effects. There were reports, for instance, that some donors were becoming disenchanted with the Romney campaign success, and we're saying, I'm going to give my money to help out House and Senate candidates for the Republican Party rather than the presidency. He had to stop that, and it's likely the case that the debate evaluation helps in that regard. Others? Jim?
There's been a lot of talk about money in politics.
Yeah, let's.
And particularly the 2010 Citizens United.
Yeah.
Citizens United decision.
Yeah.
But we haven't really heard, I guess maybe some of the closer watchers have heard a little bit about super PACs, but it's not necessarily right up front in the way that they predicted it would be. Is there any lasting effect of super PACs in that decision?
Yeah. Let's say, and here in my talk, I promised to say more about campaign finance and really didn't, so this gives a chance to make good on this promise. So, two things are notable in the campaign finance area. One is that this is a first election which neither candidate will be accepting public financing. That is, 2008 was the first time when one of the major candidates said, I'm not participating in the public financing system. I should be clear, the public financing system gives candidates an option. Once you win your party's nomination, if you agree not to spend any more money than this, more or less, the federal government will just give you $90 million and say you run your campaign with this money. But you can't raise other amounts yourself. You can raise just a little bit for accounting costs. Up until 2008, all of the major party candidates took that money and therefore accepted the constraints. Obama opted out in 2008. McCain did not. And in the aftermath of this, everybody said there's no way that anybody else would ever opt in again. And sure enough, this year there was no debate whatsoever in the Obama-Romney camp. We're not participating. So in that sense, they could raise much more than the $90 million. That actually probably has more implications, more effect than the Citizens United decision, which allows corporations and unions to give to spend independent expenditures. They still can't give directly to the campaign because they'd spend independently. Well, the combination of these two means, in the first place, that the individual candidate campaigns can raise unlimited amounts of money where they could not just 4 to 8 years ago. It also means that you have all these other groups that can also raise money to help out. On that point, though, we should recall this isn't the first time that that's happened. Many people probably think back to the 2004 campaign, the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth ads. Those were independent expenditure ads, and so it's not that this is the first time we've seen a lot of ads. And it's also not the case that corporations are funding most of those ads. If you actually look at it from the business side of view, it turns out not to make very good sense to get involved too much in these races. You're likely to turn off as many potential customers if you're in the customer business than you are, to kind of get benefits from it. And so what you do have is you have a number of wealthy individuals that are continuing to spend money in these independent expenditures. But as I say, they were doing that before. That's how we got the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth ads, as they said, from a Texas millionaire who basically funded the big part of it. So I suppose I would see, in terms of important developments in this campaign, I would not be struck by the importance of money at the presidential level, I should say. Now, if we start looking at congressional, Senate races, and House races, I would give you a very different judgment, because there you can see sometimes candidates will be out there running ads themselves, and they won't have that much money. And actually more money will be spent by an independent group that will be coming in running ads. And there you can start to see this, and you probably will see this in some North Carolina races. So, and to really just bring that home, and you also see that in judicial elections, for instance, probably more than, and you'll have more impact there than anything else. So, yes, please, thank you.
Would you say costumes are more or less involved in this campaign and this election than previous years, or even more?
That's a very good question, and here we're on the fly, and it's particularly difficult to answer that right now. I mean, we'll know the answer, I suppose, when we have the exit polls just over a month from now, and we'll get a sense. They'll ask people how frequent the youth turned out. There was a time where youth turnout was pretty low. Youth turnout is always a little lower as age increases. Likelihood of voting increases. It's not till we get to age 75 and above that we start to see a turnoff of that, perhaps just ease of getting to the ballot box. But otherwise, at every single level of age increases, your likelihood of participating increases. It's just as direct a relation we get. We did see in 2004 to some degree, and then to a greater extent in 2008, obviously a pickup in that. How to judge in 2012. There's already been a few studies coming out, and there's a sign that perhaps the college student and youth participation excitement rate isn't quite at the level as it was in 2008. But again, we're at an early stage of the process. All things considered, there's still over a month of times where there really will be engagement efforts. So too early to say for sure. We get a few early signs of it. I don't think we'll break any records this year and exceed things, but whether we stay about where we were in 2000, that's possible. Whether we fall in 2008 or whether we fall just a little bit below, that's a possibility too. But perhaps some of the folks in the room would actually be even better able to answer that than me. I mean that sincerely in that sense, to get a sense. I can draw on some of the studies that have been put forward here, but in fact, a lot of folks here would probably give a sense. I saw another hand up here. Yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there is any. It just strikes me how frequently in advertisements that candidates
Not in a meaningful fashion. Now, sometimes if you are directly telling an untruth about someone's personal record or so, you'll sometimes see candidates going to TV stations and saying, if you don't take this off the air, my lawyer will bring suit against you. And so then you see some negotiations take place, but rarely do those play out. Although I will say in North Carolina, there was a state ad that was run, a state-based ad, in a 2010 race in which a candidate actually did get some money back from people who would actually, he said, impugn him. They said they told untrue things about me. That's rare, though. And usually what you're talking about is not that you're saying that someone in their personal life did something or committed a crime that they didn't actually commit. You're talking about an overall sense of are you getting an accurate picture of the policies. One thing we should clearly note is that, and this is more evident in 2012 than any other year, is clearly the rise of the independent fact checkers. That it's rare to see an internet site or Washington Post or other sites that don't have individuals whose full-time job is to fact check ads. Though here again, it's become interesting. Then some people come back and say, "Well, I think the fact checkers got it wrong." And this is, for instance, this has come up in President Obama, his Health and Human Services Department said that it would be giving waivers to states in regard to the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. And the Romney camp began running ads saying that this was gutting the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. And some fact checkers, one person got 4 Pinocchios. That's what you do if you're really saying an untruth in the minds of the fact checkers. But then someone else came back and fact checked the fact checker, and he claimed that he didn't quite have it right. And so it's very difficult to find an independent point in political debate that is completely outside of the candidates and the debates themselves. And yet there's been an effort to do so in 2012. And I guess my point is even that's fraught with its own challenges. Yes, please.
Which campaign ad that you've seen so far has had the most truth to it?
Oh, most truth. I mean, that'd probably be a longer list. I mean, sometimes people simply say, I mean, one of the ads that's running, I think that I've seen is the Romney camp will just list the amount of debt that's currently held that's owed by the government. There's nothing untrue about that. Then the next question is, well, who contributed to that debt? Is which administrations did so? Which decisions? Which congressional decisions? Which presidential decisions? Is it possible that incurring some debt now in the short term was good for the long term for the economy? So rarely do you actually see untruths, I suppose is my point. It's all that you try to put things, take certain situations and you try to use those to your best example. There'd be a lot of ads that are true, that are not untrue. I suppose I particularly called out the getting tough on China ads because it really in the things that are at stake in this election and the issues that are on the levels of importance. Again, acknowledging textile workers in North Carolina and some others might feel particularly affected by that. That just doesn't rise anywhere near the level. I'm thinking about the Bowles-Simpson discussion that I had the opportunity to sit in last Tuesday night at Wade Chapel, and to think of the number of issues that they went down, the tough choices that will have to be made with regard to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, taxes. Those are the issues that are at stake. And I'm more struck by, and perhaps some of you are struck by, the fact that those all don't seem to be in anywhere near the kind of the focus of some of the ads that we see. So as I say, we're in a battleground state, and I don't know, maybe it's certainly a good thing to be a TV station owner in a battleground state. You'd have to decide for yourself whether you've benefited overall, and whether you've kind of become more informed about the election than you were when we weren't a battleground state. Yeah. Jack.
I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit on the disconnect between the increase in negative and attack ads and the emphasis that candidates place on themselves as presidential.
Yeah.
You see how negative, especially in battleground states, where
Yeah.
last night in the debate in here, and you
Yeah.
mentioned the 47%
Yeah.
for distribution.
It's interesting to say that when the McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform plan passed in 2002, did a number of things, but one of the things it did is it said, if you are running an ad, you must include in that, I am so-and-so and I approve this ad. We take that for granted today. It turns out that didn't exist prior to 2002. It's now a federal requirement. And what were they doing by that? They said, it's a stand by your ad provision. If you have to stand by your ad, you'll be less likely to engage in this negative behavior. Well, we'd have to see. It's a jury's out on whether you can actually see that effect being played. But there still is, which you point to, there's a sense that candidates themselves, there's some logic to that McCain-Feingold provision that you don't want to be associated with something that might be seen as unseemly or beneath you. And so there's a bit of a division of labor in the ad wars where the candidate campaigns try to stay a little bit above that, but then you let the independent groups do the work for you. You can't coordinate with those independent groups, but they kind of, you know what they're going to be doing, and then they will want to. And so it's no surprise that you see different styles of ads, precisely because of that sense that the candidates themselves want to stay a little bit above the fray, and it's reflected in the debate last night. Although I will say, if for those who might have tuned into the gubernatorial debate last night, that was not necessarily the case. The candidates were very willing to go right after each other and repeat some of the things that they'd said in TV ads, and they said, "Are you willing to stand by that?" Say, "Yeah, I'm willing to stand by that." So it might have been something particular to last night in the presidential debate. That is, put another way, in the second and third debates, where one could even see a little bit of difference there. Yes, please. Oh, yeah.
Oh, you go. No, go on.
Okay.
My big question is, when are we going to have a woman?
Yeah, it's it could be 2016. I put it another way. I think 20 years ago, one could probably still see a number of people whose vote was perhaps affected by voting for a female candidate versus a male candidate. By the time we got to the 2008 and probably likely in 2016, it's probably likely the case that for a declining number of people, and perhaps a very small number of people, would that continue to be the barrier that it probably was to a greater degree in previous years. Yes. Or were you just pointing out Mary? Oh, you're pointing out. Okay. Is that helping out? Good. Yes.
I have never seen a split screen for a debate like that,
Yeah.
where Obama looked disengaged.
Yeah. You know, it's amazing how the level of detail that these debates are negotiated for. I mean, they negotiate whether the debate will intersect with a World Series game, whether it'll start in early October, whether it'll be packed together in a week and a half or spread out as these years will be. I mean, all these things. And one of the things that's often negotiated is whether or not the cameras will be allowed to be focusing on someone who is not speaking at the time. And this particular came up after the 2000 Bush-Gore first debate that I mentioned, where in many cases that the idea was that Gore, going into that, did not expect the cameras to be on him, and so he didn't really think a whole lot that there was any reason to be overly concerned about facial expressions. If you're pained by something, you're going to show your pain and discuss it. And the cameras did that. And there was much discussion afterwards about whether the cameras were improper, whether they were violating some understanding by doing so. I had not yet looked at the rules of the negotiation and the debate commission for 2012. My understanding is they must have either allowed the networks to do whatever they want, or I haven't heard any sense that was violating the rules of the game. But it certainly becomes important to do so. And by this point in time, one would expect the candidates would be on record that there's a good chance of that happening. And so you would want to always, at any time in the debate, probably operate under the assumption that how you're behaving or acting or looking could well be televised, and you can be sure that the networks are going to pick up on that.
We'll all pay attention.
Yes, I think so. Did not do that. Ah, okay. Interesting. Good.
Because their funding's getting cut.
Oh, that's right.
They only have one camera. We're saving the money for the other
That's
camera.
right. Before they. Good. Well,
Can I ask you I guess maybe a naive question? Past elections, Max Fleeman, who was running for Senate or?
Senate in Georgia.
How, in God's name, did they paint him in such a way that he lost his seat?
Yeah.
The country loves veterans. And then quadriplegic? I mean, what happened there? I mean, it's in the past, but I'm still amazed by the fact that he wasn't able to keep his seat.
Yeah, and it'd probably be a longer discussion of that particular issue in Georgia. It was a key Senate race where that came up. It was in 2002 election, and it was an election that became nationalized in certain respects. That is, Republicans running around the country argued that in certain respects, that this was actually over the creation of the Department of Homeland Security actually was the issue in there. And so they were able to argue that Max Cleland had been in some ways an obstacle to the creation of this Department of Homeland Security, the aftermath of September 11th. And one wouldn't have ordinarily thought that he would be vulnerable to defeating, yet did turn out to be vulnerable in that regard, because people ostensibly were willing to look away from particular attributes and merits of the candidate to these broader issues that can sometimes sweep things through. One thing we've learned is that congressional elections are generally about particular candidates and what you think of them, and in that case, candidates stand or fall on their own merits and their background. But sometimes congressional elections get nationalized and people go to the polls not thinking, did this candidate do something, do a good job, but am I generally more favorable with Republicans and Democrats? Clearly, the 2006 election was a nationalized election, for instance, where Democrats swept through and won big number of seats. And then the reverse happened in 2010, where you had Republicans get a net gain of 63 seats in the 2010 election in the House. A lot of those decisions were not made because, I don't like this particular candidate. Probably in a lot of cases, they probably did like that person, probably even got good constituent service from that person, help with Social Security checks, but they were thinking of other things other than the candidate. They were thinking of a broad picture. That happens sometimes. It's unusual, but it does happen in congressional elections.
On that particular election that
Yeah.
was identified with the fact that he might have been in the way of Homeland
That's
Security.
yeah. Yes, please.
Do you have any comments or observations on the North Carolina gubernatorial race?
Yeah, what to say about this? It's a surprise in North Carolina. It was certainly not something we're used to, that a Republican candidate has a lead in an election. That is, the times when the previous times, there have been rare times when Republicans have won. It's usually because actually they've been swept in because of top of the ticket difference, such as 1972. Nixon wins big. He wins all but 2 states and sweeps in a Republican into the governor's office. 1984 was the next time that a Republican governor kept in. That was Reagan's landslide victory, again winning all but a few states. So what's unusual about this is here we have a competitive presidential election, and you have a situation in which a Republican gubernatorial candidate still has a very good chance of winning. It probably will become slightly more competitive, and it still probably will be affected by what happens at the top of the ticket. One need only remember that actually some polls were showing in 2008, Pat McCrory, this is of course his second time running, and he was running against Bev Perdue. Actually, polls going in the 2000 election showed him maybe with a 3 or 4 percentage point lead going in, and he lost by 3 points. What happened? People came out, get back to my old point, people were thinking about the presidential election, they showed up to vote, they either cast a straight party ticket, or they said, I'm really in favor of Democrats in this election. And so by the time we came around with election day, there was a turnaround. So it's a long way of saying that you can look at a lot of polls right now and see advantages. You've got to remember that it's all about what happens in terms of turnout and how that affects people when they actually show up. So, yes, please.
Can you explain to me why Beth Perdue decided not to run for re-election?
Well, when they've done kind of some looking into this, her campaign did take a poll about shortly before that decision was made, and I assume some things were asked in that poll, and presumably one thing that was asked in that poll is what's my re-election chances, and presumably they didn't look good. And in that sense, there could be other members of the party that would say, if we want to hold on to this seat as a party and you're not the best vehicle for doing so, someone else could have a better chance at doing so. We don't know the exact answer. Perhaps later on she said she'll probably write a book about her experiences, and presumably would get a little more insight there.
Because other than cutting the cuts to education, which is really the legislature,
Yeah.
I thought she did a good
Yeah.
job. I mean, did you see where she was?
Well, you raised the next question, is what led her polling to show this, and that's probably a longer question and no easy answers on there. So, good. Well, but yeah, please. Yeah.
My first follow-up to that, actually, because I was thinking about what you said earlier about crossing the aisle, and admitting to that can be detrimental to
Yeah, yeah.
what you said. So last night, Cameron Clinton had to ask 7 times for
Yeah, yeah.
to respond to citing a specific
Example, yes,
cutting
yes.
across the aisle.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Is it possible he was evading the question because he was not able to produce a satisfactory?
It's a good question. In general, again, the conventional wisdom is that when you're in the general election campaign, you want to tout to some degree. In the primary campaign, you probably don't want to answer that question. But in the general election, it's generally seen, at least conventional wisdom. I was trying to argue that maybe we're departing from conventional wisdom to some degree. But the conventional wisdom is you would want to do so in the way that Romney last night in the debate wanted to tout the fact that he had an 80-some percentage Democratic support in the Massachusetts legislature. So that's more conventional wisdom. That's just what you'd expect. So it may well be that he just didn't have any immediate responses, rather than he was consciously avoiding that. Yes, please.
You talked some about media and the segmentation and
Yeah.
polarization. Are we seeing anything interesting in terms of social media and its
Yeah.
relevant impact?
Yeah.
on what's going on?
You know, it certainly is. Use of social media is only increasing. We saw it in 2008 really being used for fundraising was the most notable use of it. You have to think, certainly, to go along with my point earlier about who are the undecideds, they're oftentimes the folks that are not seeking out political information. One thing we see is social media is used to draw them in, and again, they might go on a social media site not for political purposes, and yet that's where they encounter it. So you certainly see the candidates, the campaigns of that view, that how do we reach these undecideds? Well, as I say, maybe daytime TV, maybe late night TV, maybe social media, and so that's where it's most going to hit those folks. Good. Well, thank you very much.